A new author to me, The Sky Calls was the first literary effort by Hal Adas, and one of those books I had not heard of, but during the course of wandering FA, I saw it from his page and decided to take a chance. The setting is, for the most part, modern world, taking place both in the present time and 2 years prior, where the bulk of the story takes place. The main character is David Garacki, who learns early in the story that he has cancer. Faced with this life-changing news, he seeks treatment and is inadvertently given a formula for a bird. His body then begins changing, becoming that of an eagle. Personally, I found it a little hard to get to know David since we see so little of his life before we get the cancer news. With most of the book set in the medical facility during and after his transformation, we get to witness his journey from human to eagle, but I felt he could have used a little more agency. The problem with the story as a medical process is that very little of the novel is actually under the main character's control, and as such, at least for me, I found it less attuned to my preferences. Now, I don't know if there is a way to do a medical-based transformation in a more active fashion, but if asked to describe the protagonist of this book, I'd have a hard time doing it other than the guy that turns into an eagle. Sam is David's best friend and is his primary emotional support during the story. His most staunch advocate, he regularly fights for David's rights and is a loyal and supportive companion. Sam gets points from me for sticking to his friend even through such extreme circumstances as a change of species, but like David, he's tough to describe. The biggest thing I kept wondering with Sam was what their relationship was. They used the word love a lot between them, but I couldn't tell whether that was friend love or romantic, and while that in itself may be an indicator, I don't usually use the word love when it comes to friends. I would have appreciated a clear definition as to whether they were anything more than friends, as I think an awareness of their potential status as a couple would have greatly helped my interest in the story. David Garacki is a normal person living a normal life until one day he learns he has cancer. While seeking treatment for his condition, a mistake is made, one that will have lasting repercussions on his future. At its core, it's a story about a guy turning into a bird. Now, I've been in furry for a long time, and I'll say that as a transformation story, it's not bad. It's clear the author knows his stuff when it comes to birds, being an avian veterinarian. The terms and descriptions from David's perspective demonstrates a clear and complete knowledge of birds and how they perceive their world. Where I think it lacks is an additional layer of depth. While it does fulfill the basic requirements of the story, I feel like we don't get enough of a picture of who David is prior to his transformation and cancer news. The job in the early chapters is to establish a baseline, so we know where he comes from and who he is before the cancer comes into play, because once it does, it takes over the story and people stop listening because it's a very important and dominating event. We see a little of David at work and getting a message from his doctor, but since his retiring coworker has no effect on the rest of the story, I feel it could have been better served by maybe a meeting with an additional character besides Sam that would have added to his world. Either his mother or a girlfriend or something. In hindsight, I realized that the story is missing its first act. We needed to see David before the transformation and cancer so we understand who he is after. A few more chapters setting up his world before it's thrown into chaos would have done significant wonders for this particular story. All we really see of his social circle is just Sam, and to me that was very limiting. We as the audience really needed someone for Sam to talk to outside of the facilities, someone to maybe turn their back on David to show other reactions besides support, maybe what his job did or said after he went in for treatment, something. I'd also have to say that at least for me, I found some of the interactions to be, and I'm trying to think of how to say this, implausible. When the news of David's transformation becomes known to the characters, both the Doctor, Sam, and David are all very accepting and supportive, at least on the surface, and it would have made a big difference to me to see at least one person express some resistance or misgivings to the whole affair. We're not given any indication that David is a furry or has any interest in transformation, but without that qualifier, it's even more unlikely that when given this news that he wouldn't react more strenuously or incredulously. For the most part, everyone just accepts it, and it really isn't realistic. The normal reaction would be denial at the very least, and probably a little bit of anger or fear. Now, I understand that the author was not necessarily looking to write that kind of story, but I feel it would have added a level of authenticity to the narrative. Now, I acknowledge that perhaps it may be the fact that the author is a furry that may have occluded the normal reaction, assuming his reader base would be furry as well, but as an objective reviewer, I have to say it's an obstacle to casual readers. One thing I noticed, particularly towards the ending, was that the author had a tendency to repeat himself. On multiple occasions, especially in the last chapter, I noticed a repetition of certain phrases, often within lines of each other. It's a minor point, but one I think the editor should have caught. Now, I will give the author a lot of credit for his depiction of both the transformation and the rehabilitation process. No doubt his expertise comes in handy for how one would handle someone in this situation, and it really shows. The equipment and lessons that David is given after his change were some of the more interesting story aspects for me personally. With regard to the ending, and I will say this in as non-spoilery a way as possible, I thought it was an odd choice to skip ahead 2 years and then twice in the first few pages dip back into the story to fill in the blanks. I think that material would have played better in an intervening chapter, either to carry on the events of the preceding chapter for one more chapter set in the present time, or at least finish up the events already in motion. Instead, it jumps ahead a bit too early, in my personal opinion, and since the author was already depicting the event in question, it makes more sense to me to wrap up that before jumping ahead just to jump back to it anyway. The ending was reasonably satisfying, if a bit too perfect. It potentially could have been a story in itself, but everything works out as well as it could. And while I don't have a problem with happy endings, I'm reminded of a comment regarding the first version of The Matrix. People couldn't accept it because it was too perfect. Now, I don't say that's what happened here, but a little bit of tarnish would have made it, at least to me, a bit better, I think, in that while life isn't perfect, it's good enough. All in all, I'd say I enjoyed it, but as far as recommending it, I'd have to say I would only suggest it for transformation enthusiasts and furry fandom members who maybe aren't as analytical as I am. Definitely a good story, but one that I felt was in need of a little polish.
Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!